After you've done that, go ahead and open up your Bibles to the book of Colossians. Colossians chapter 2 and 3 primarily is where we'll spend most of our time this morning as we discuss the nature of our family. Keeping with our yearly theme for this year, we're talking about building strong homes, and so we're going to discuss that a little bit this morning. I look out and I see a little bit of sleepiness, and I would only imagine that's because we had a big week last week. It's always kind of tough preaching the week after gospel meeting, not only because you have lots of people that say, why are you still here? Why couldn't we get the other guy? That's not usually the reason. But it's because everybody's here and we've had a long week. And so we had a lot of people that were visiting with us, but we had great attendance. And so what that tells me is everybody was making an effort to be here. Everyone was making an effort to be engaged. But the week after is always a little bit exhausting. And so I appreciate not only your attendance there, but also your attention this morning. But I would also like to add on top of that I thought it was an incredibly edifying week. Those of you who were here that heard Russ speak, I'm sure walked away, no matter if you heard 5 minutes or all 6 sermons, I'm sure all of us walked away edified. If you haven't heard those sermons, I would encourage you to do so. They'll all be on the website as of this afternoon. Most of them are up. That's my fault, not Joe's. 4 of the 6 are up, but I'll put the last 2 up this afternoon. But do some time this weekend, or take some time this week and go online and listen to those, because I guarantee you that you will be edified by that. Our next gospel meeting is already in the works. I've already confirmed it with the person that we have next year. And he's a person that's familiar to most of us. We're going to have Eddie Caskey with us in the spring of 2020. And so go ahead and mark your calendars for that. That'll be, of course, 12 months from now. But go ahead and make plans for that tentatively around the April and May time period. A few weeks ago, I saw an article that I thought was absolutely fascinating. And I've seen these types of articles before, but I've never really given time to kind of look at them and think on them and dwell on them. And I thought it just matched up perfectly with what we're discussing this morning. And what it was a photographer showing kind of the behind the scenes of all these photographs. If you go on Facebook or you go on Instagram, you see these really elaborate pictures where it almost feels like people are blasting into space, or they're kind of behind this really majestic looking waterfall. And as a non-photographer myself, I always look at those and I think to myself, how do they get those shots? Do they just actually get in a rocket ship and go all the way to Mars, and that's how they get this type of stuff? But they show the behind the scenes of it. I thought these pictures were absolutely fascinating. If you look there on your left, for instance, you see this really mystical looking woman that seems to be gazing into the great beyond. She's literally sitting in the blind section of Lowe's. And they just kind of have a little bit of stage lighting behind her to kind of help with that. You have this other one where it looks like the guy is kind of reaching into a black hole. It's a dude standing in the TV section at Walmart that just kind of has his hands up there. And so when you look at these types of pictures, it's always kind of illuminating, for lack of a better phrase, because you see what the photographer wants to show you, but then you see what's really happening kind of behind the scenes. And I thought that's such a perfect metaphor sometimes for our lives. Because if you are on Facebook, or if you go outside your front door, if you look at magazines, if you look at TV, it's always what people want you to see. Nobody goes on Facebook, well, at least not most people don't go on Facebook, and just start complaining about everything about their life. And they don't post the most unflattering picture of themselves. They don't post pictures where their kids are screaming in the corner because you happen to take away their juice and they wanted juice, but they really wanted milk, or they said juice, but they wanted milk. Nobody ever shows those pictures, or at least I don't. But nobody ever shows those types of pictures. And I think the temptation usually is for us, sometimes we always want to put our best foot forward, but we sometimes, when we put those pictures up, desperately want the reality to be like that. When we post a picture of ourselves where, I never have this problem, but our hair looks awesome, and we just look really good, we desperately want that to be what our reality is. And that creates sometimes some tension in our life. Because what the reality is of our life not only matches up with what we hope it to be in our lives. And that's where that tension comes in. And you can't look at these types of pictures of other people with their happy families. You can't help but look at these types of pictures and think to yourself, that's what I want for my life. I want that perfect, idyllic family life where all your finances just magically line up. Where you have the lake house, or you have the dream job, or you have the six-pack abs, or whatever it is that you want in your life. You desperately want that. And sometimes when we don't have that, we think to ourselves, my life is somewhat less than idealistic. And I'm here to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, you can have the perfect family life. And this is where I'm going to go really Joel Osteen on you. But you can have the perfect life. You can have everything you want. You can have your wildest dreams come true, as long as those dreams are rooted in something of substance. And that's what I think you see in Colossians chapter 2. When you look at Colossians chapter 2, there's a whole lot of things happening in this passage. Colossians chapter 2, Colossians chapter 3 discuss this idea of the true substance of religion. And especially if you look at chapter 2, he kind of discusses two main ideas. He talks about philosophies that are empty, philosophies that promise a lot of great, amazing things, but really are kind of empty. You see that, for instance, in verse 8. When Paul writes in Colossians 2 and verse 8, see to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception, according to the tradition of men, according to the elementary principles of the world, rather than according to Christ. Now, I think in some ways he's talking about religious legalism. I think he's talking about Judaizing teachers a little bit. But I think what he mainly has in view there in Colossians chapter 2 and verse 8 is this Greek Roman mythology, this kind of wisdom that just seems to appear so wise. Somebody that I absolutely can't stand, and that's not just because he's a Yankee, but somebody that I can't stand, for instance, is Yogi Berra. And if you know anything about Yogi Berra, he always has these kind of wild statements, these things that he kind of has, these little pithy statements that literally, ladies and gentlemen, make no sense. One of the things that he said, for instance, is when you come to a fork in the road, take it. I've stared at that statement for probably longer than I should have, and I still have no idea what he's talking about. And yet it kind of appears to be wise on the surface. And so I think that's a little bit of what he's addressing in Colossians chapter 2. When you jump down a little further, what he's talking about, really in the meat of it, is this type of religious, fundamental legalism that has no essence in godliness whatsoever. For instance, in Colossians chapter 2, down in verse 16, he says, therefore no one is to act as your judge in regard to food or drink, or in respect to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath day, things which are a mere shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. What he's arguing for there in Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 through 17 is, I can't believe, this is what some people would say, I can't believe you don't celebrate Christmas as a religious holiday. That's just blasphemy. I can't believe you don't celebrate Easter as a religious holiday. I can't believe you don't keep the Sabbath. I can't believe you don't keep the days of atonement. That's just blasphemy. But what Paul really says here in Colossians chapter 2, verse 16 and 17 is, don't let anyone act as your judge in regards to that, because those things are temporary. The substance, ladies and gentlemen, belongs to Christ. And that's how he picks up this statement. Look right after that, there in verse 18. He says, let no one keep defrauding you of your prize by delighting in self-abasement, the worship of angels, taking a stand on visions he has seen, inflated without cause by his flesh and mind, and not holding fast to the head, from whom the entire body being supplied and held together by the joints and ligaments, grows with the growth which is from God. God is the substance, ladies and gentlemen. Jesus is the substance. Not the feast days that have an appearance of things that are great, but really don't do anything for you. He doubles down on it, and then he really takes it personal here in verse 20 by saying, if you have died with Christ to the elementary principles of the world, why then, as if you were living to the world, do you submit yourselves to decrees such as don't handle, don't taste, don't touch, which all refer to things destined to perish with use, in accordance with the commandments and the teachings of men. Listen to verse 23. These are matters which have to be sure of the appearance of wisdom and self-made religion and self-abasement and severe treatment of the body, for have no value against fleshly indulgence. It sounds real religious, what Paul's saying here. It sounds real religious to say, well, I don't eat kale chips. I don't eat kale chips. But it sounds really religious to say, I don't eat kale chips because they are anathema. God hates them. And so I'm going to keep myself pure, which I think is ironically the opposite of what kale chips are trying to fulfill. But I'm going to keep myself pure by not eating that. And people look at that and they say, oh man, he's got to be really religious. Look at how holy he is that he can hold to that. And what Paul is saying in Colossians chapter 2, especially this last section, is there's no wisdom in that. It doesn't matter to God if you keep yourself pure from kale chips. Nobody cares about that. That's the appearance of wisdom. But there's no substance there. And that's what he finishes with, that chapter with. And then as soon as he finishes that, he goes into chapter 3 and takes it even more personal by talking to the individual there in chapter 3, verse 1. And he says, if you have been raised up with Christ, keep seeking the things above where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind then, verse 2, on the things above, not on the things that are on earth, for you have died and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory. If you want to be holy, Paul says, if you want to be righteous, if you want to be godly, it's not to be found in these arbitrary rules that we just made up 20 years ago, that we just kind of concocted in our brains 100 years ago, that seem religious. Holiness, ladies and gentlemen, is found within Jesus. It's found within looking to the things above. As Christians, ladies and gentlemen, that's where our attention needs to be. We need to stop filling our mind and our body with things that appear to have substance, but really isn't worth anything. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. You're probably looking at me thinking to yourself, what is any of this? Religious legalism? What is empty philosophies? What does any of this have to do with our life as family? Let me tell you right now, I think there's one very big illusion, but I think ultimately what Colossians 3 talks about can be applied to this. Because when I said earlier that you can have that idealistic life, you can have everything you dream of, I meant every word of that. As long as that substance, ladies and gentlemen, is in something that's substantial. As long as it's something that's eternal. So many of us are obsessed in our families with keeping up with the Joneses. Well, that guy got that car, so I got to get this car. Well, that guy got a 3,000 square foot house, I'm going to build me a 5,000 square foot house. None of that has any substance. You know what makes for a happy home, ladies and gentlemen? Keeping Christ front and center. Keeping God the center, the beginning, the middle of everything. That's where our focus should be. And when he says here in Colossians chapter 3, speaking to the individual in the first 4 verses, seek your mind or set your mind on things above, that same thing can be applied to families. As families, we need to be setting our minds on things above, looking to God, looking to heaven. That's where our goal is. Our goal and my goal as a parent should not be to get Logan to be the greatest baseball player on the face of the earth. If he happens to do that by virtue of 300 hours a week training, so be it. But my goal as a Christian and as a father is not to get him to be the best baseball player. It's not to get him to make the most money. It's not to get him to have perfect attendance K through 12. It's to help him get to heaven. That's my job as a father. And some people look at this and say, well, that's taking it out of context. Colossians 3 applies to the individual, not to the family. And I would agree with that, kind of. But when you look at Colossians chapter 3, which deals purely with the individual, and then you jump down to the culmination in verse 17. Colossians chapter 3, verse 17, you kind of have this penultimate verse where Paul writes, whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks through him to God the Father. Whatever you do, word or deed, whatever it is that your life is consistent of, give thanks to God. Do all according to his name. Do all in his authority. And then you know what he talks about right after that? Look at verses 18 down to verse 21. What does he discuss? He discusses the nature of families. That's not an illogical conclusion that Paul drives to. It's not as if he spends all his time discussing the idea of individuals, and then he just kind of goes back to this idea of families and says, well, now we're going to jump to this topic. We're going to shift gears and go to that. That's not what Paul does. A perfect, idyllic family life is made up of the components that are addressed in the first 17 verses. It begins in chapter 3, verse 1, by setting your mind on things above, but then it goes immediately after that to this idea of selflessness. When you look at Colossians chapter 3, for instance, and you see what he talks about right after this, in Colossians chapter 3, starting verse 5. This is very similar to Ephesians and Galatians in a lot of ways with this lust of the flesh, the things to avoid. But notice the common thread here in Colossians chapter 3. In Colossians chapter 3, starting in verse 5, he says, therefore consider the members of your earthly body as dead in immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, greed, which amounts to idolatry. For it is because of these things that the wrath of God will come upon the sons of disobedience, and in them you also once walked when you were living in sin. All these things are disobedience. That's what he mentions there in verse 6 and 7. All of these things have some kind of commonality within the idea of disobedience. But you know what the common thread is amongst all of them? All of them have to do with seeking self first above the interest of everybody else. And in a church, this is absolutely catastrophic. If I'm up here preaching things that make me happy, if more or less, or even worse than that, if I'm up here preaching things just simply to save my job, then that is wrong. And anybody else would be doing the exact same thing. If Howard is sitting here thinking to himself, I could talk to Linda about X, Y, and Z, or A, B, and C, and D, and E, and all the other things. But I choose not to because I just don't really want to get into that. I want to save that friendship. Or I see false doctrine happening in the church, and I could speak up, but I don't really want to because I don't want to rock the boat. And that's a selfish attitude. And what he mentions here specifically in Colossians chapter 3, especially there in verse 5, when he talks about sexual immorality, when he talks about covetousness, all of these things have to do with gratifying the flesh above anything else. And that's why he mentions in Colossians chapter 3, especially there in verse 7, that's why he mentions covetousness and idolatry. I am putting this thing in between myself and God. And that really is the main pursuit of a lot of families. A lot of families, when they think of this idyllic type of life, they think of vacations that they're going to go on, they're going to think of cars that they can buy their kids, they're thinking of the toys they can give their family, all these different things. But in reality, that's not the substance. That's not what we should be focusing on. And a lot of people are under the belief, kind of, that's what we talked about this morning, a lot of people are under the belief of saying, well, if I can just attain blank, then I can give my family blank, which results in heaven and hell. If I can achieve this in my work, then I can have this, and then everybody in my life will be happy. My budget will be balanced and I'll have the car that I want. That's when happiness truly comes. Let me ask you a question. And this is not specific to Jeff or anybody else. Well, let me ask you a question. What is the number in your mind? Whatever that number is, it's unique to everybody, but what is that number in your mind that if you had sitting in your bank account right now, you would think to yourself, that's perfection. That's happiness. And whatever it is, it can line up your financial goals. It can be enough money to take trips with. It can be enough money to buy the Rangers and then do something with them with. Whatever that number is in your mind, what's that number to you? I'll tell you right now, the reality is it's probably lower than you think. There was a study that came out of Princeton in 2010, and this number obviously is fluctuating a little bit because that was 9 years ago. But there was a study that came out of Princeton in 2010 where they tried to measure if economic increase, if your financial standing simultaneously improved your life satisfaction and your emotional well-being. Now, life satisfaction absolutely did. If you advanced in your career, you were more content with your job, you were satisfied with your growth, that did increase with your income. But emotional well-being did not. As a matter of fact, they identified the exact number that emotional well-being didn't drop, but it stayed stagnant. The number is about $75,000. $75,000 was the number that they found that people who had 3 million, 10 million, 100 million, it didn't really matter because it was diminishing returns past that point. You had enough to pay for your mortgage, you had enough to put food on the table, and everything past that was just kind of gravy. And even though you may be more satisfied with your job, you may be able to give more to other people, it didn't increase your intrinsic joy and your intrinsic happiness. That's what that study discovered. And so if you're sitting here thinking to yourself, if I have X amount of dollars and I can achieve this with my life, then all of a sudden everything will be perfect. I'm here to tell you that the word awakening is when you get there, it may not be what you think it could be. I want you to look at the book of Proverbs, chapter 3. Proverbs chapter 3. I think it's fitting that Solomon doesn't begin the book of Proverbs, but kind of hits it pretty early in this discussion. He talks about monetary wealth. Monetary wealth. Proverbs chapter 3, starting in verse 5. My voice cracked there a little bit. Proverbs chapter 3, starting in verse 5. Listen to what Solomon has to say here. He says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding, and in all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make your paths straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord, turn away from evil. It will be healing to your body and refreshment to your bones. Honor the Lord from your wealth and from the first of all your produce, and your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will overflow with new wine. I think it's very interesting when Solomon talks about true happiness and a perfect home and how to achieve this type of almost family nirvana. He doesn't begin with finances. He doesn't say max out your 401k and make sure that your balance or your budget is balanced according to the Dave Ramsey plan and everything was perfect. He begins it, ladies and gentlemen, with God. Put God first, and everything will kind of fall into place. If you have God first in your life, if His goals are your goals and His dreams are your dreams, then everything else more or less falls into place. Doesn't mean you'll become a millionaire, but it certainly means you'll be more happy with what you have. Haggai says much the same thing. Look at Haggai. Talking now after the exile and the remnant has returned. Haggai is a post-exilic book. Haggai returns and he looks upon the state of the nation. Haggai, by the way, is on page 1468 in my Bible. If you need to sing a song like Russ did last week, you can do that if you want to. But in Haggai chapter 1, what Haggai more or less is showing up on is he's seeing the state of the temple. The temple is in complete disrepair. But what Haggai also notices is that people have kind of made homes for themselves. The temple is in disrepair, but everybody's kind of taking care of number one, which is themselves. And so Haggai begins in chapter 1 and verse 2 by saying, thus says the Lord of hosts. And that phrase, Lord of hosts, I think is very specific for this book. It's used elsewhere, but it's deliberately used for this book because of the purpose. He says, the Lord of hosts says this time, or he says, this people says, the time has not come, even the time for the house of the Lord rebuilt. And then the word of the Lord came by Haggai the prophet, saying, is it time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses, while this house lies desolate? The argument that Haggai is making by the mouth of God is, these people are saying, I'll get to the temple eventually. But first, what I need to do is I need to build my house. And not only do I need to build my house, but I need to get my sunroom off to the side. I need to get my whirlpool jacuzzi built in the back. I need to get my 6-car garage. I need to get my lake house. I need to get all these things built. And then I'll get to building God's temple. They say it's not time for that right now. Look at verse 5. Therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. In essence, Think to what you're doing and measure it up against your life. Think about where your priorities are and examine your actions. Consider your ways. Verse 6, you have sown much, but you harvest little. You eat, but there's not enough to be satisfied. You drink, but there's not enough to become drunk. You put on clothing, but no one is warm enough. And listen to this. He who earns wages to put into a purse with holes. Ladies and gentlemen, if you are trying to achieve whatever financial, independent, economic, CEO status in your life, but God is not the focal point. He's not the building block. He's not the foundation of your life by which all of your priorities rest, then you are putting money into a purse that is filled with holes. Because at the end of time, no matter what you've achieved in this life, as we mentioned in class, if you've broken every record, if you become Jeff Bezos type wealthy, Jeff Bezos pre-divorce type wealthy, and you're this, and you do that, and you do all these different things, eventually you're going to die. And eventually, as Ecclesiastes talks about, that inheritance is going to be given to somebody who just wastes it all. And if he doesn't waste it all, 1,000 years from now, somebody's going to waste it all. And if it never gets wasted, at some point, God's going to come back in flaming fire and burn everything else up on this earth, and the only thing that matters will be your soul. And so if you're sitting here this morning trying to achieve this and thinking that the perfect family life resides within that, but your priority is not with God, you're fighting a losing battle. Not just an uphill battle. You're fighting a losing battle. Immediately after this, in Colossians chapter 3, he discusses the nature of communication. Look back at Colossians chapter 3. In Colossians chapter 3, starting in verse 8, once again talking to the individual, specific application to inter-church relationships, general application to us within the home. In Colossians chapter 3, starting in verse 8, listen to what he says here. And notice especially where he puts the emphasis. Colossians chapter 3 pivots out of talking about immorality, especially idolatry. And in verse 8 he says, but in them you also once walked when you were that was verse 7, when you were living in them. Now verse 8. But now you also put them all aside, all these things, anger, wrath, malice, slander, abusive speech from your mouth. Don't lie to one another. Since you laid aside the old self with its evil practices and have put on the new self, who is being renewed to a true knowledge according to the image of the one who created him, a renewal, verse 11, in which there is no distinction between Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave and freeman, but Christ is all and in all. As most churches in this time period were, the first century, this church was incredibly diverse. And I would argue that even in today's modern world, even in Greenville, Texas, it can still be very, very diverse. People come from different backgrounds. People come from different socioeconomic classes. We come from different education levels. And so we're all meeting within this congregation. And so what he says specifically here in chapter 3 is he says, don't slander one another. Don't put another one down. Don't speak with wrath or with anger, with malice and slander in your hearts. Don't try to create dissension amongst the body of Christ. And especially what he mentions here, and I love how he just kind of highlights this, is he says, do not lie to one another. If I lie to Joyce, which you would lie to Joyce, that's like fighting with the tape there. But if I lie to Joyce, it's going to be very hard for Joyce to trust me from that point forward. Now, Joyce eventually will, because Joyce is just that kind of person. But if I'm known as the guy who goes around and just lies to everybody, then you're not going to be able to trust me on physical things, and you're surely not going to trust me on spiritual things. I want you to look at James chapter 3. James is on my mind for some reason. I don't understand it. But look at James chapter 3. I love what James has to say here in this passage. James chapter 3, starting in verse 8. He talks about the tongue. That's what most of chapter 3 is. That's how he starts it with. But when you get down to verse 8, he makes very specific application to the tongue and the purpose of it. And he says here in James chapter 3, starting in verse 8, no one can tame the tongue because it is a restless evil and full of deadly poison. That doesn't mean you should just say whatever you want to, by the way. That just means pay attention to what you say. Focus on it. Don't just let it run wild. Verse 9, with it we bless our Lord and Father. With it we curse men who have been made in the likeness of God. Listen to this in verse 10. Picks up in verse 9. Look at verse 10. From the same mouth come both blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be this way. Does a fountain, verse 11, send out from the same opening both fresh and bitter water? Can a fig tree, verse 12, my brethren, produce olives? Or can a vine produce figs? Nor can salt water produce fresh. Ladies and gentlemen, we are Christians. And even when we leave this church building, when we go home into our houses, and we sit in our living room, watch TV, we eat dinner, we are still Christians. And if I look at my wife, or I look at my child, or I look at these other people, and I'm just lying all over the place, if I'm cursing them and then I'm blessing them, and I show up on Sunday morning and I'm singing songs and I'm cussing like a sailor on the way home from church, my family at the very least has become very confused about where my priorities lay. And the same thing applies, gentlemen, when we get home. If we sit here and we talk about, we need to go to church, we need to focus on services, we need to focus on God, and then my whole life is built up around my career, or baseball, or TV, or my hobbies, then there's two things coming out of the same fountain. Where are our priorities? Where's our focus at? And so when he says here in Colossians chapter 3, don't lie to one another, don't slander one another, don't speak malice to one another. He talks about keeping those communications clear and keeping those communications holy. But did you notice the motivation? If you look back in Colossians chapter 3, what he says specifically there in verses 10 and 11, as he talks about how you're all of one body, and then he gets specific by saying some of you are barbarians, some of you are Scythians, some of you are Jews, some of you are freemen, some of you are slaves, but you all come from a different background. And it'd be very easy if I was a ranking Roman citizen that day to look at somebody else and say, because you're beneath me, or because you're this, or because you're that, I'm going to speak differently to you. You have special application to this within the church of Colossae itself. Because as most of us know, the book of Philemon is most likely written to a member at the church of Colossae. A man by the name of Philemon who probably had a house big enough that the church met in. If you remember, Onesimus is tasked with carrying the letter back to Philemon with the express intention of receiving him back into the church of God. And it would have been very easy for Philemon to look at Onesimus, who was his slave, and condescend towards him and be mean towards him, to denigrate him, to downgrade him, simply because of his status. And we look at that, we think, how horrible that would be. And yet then as husbands, we turn around and look at our wives, and we talk down to them. We look at our kids who are supposed to be subordinate to us and supposed to be respectful, and we just make fun of them, we tease them, or we condescend towards them. You flip that script a little bit, and then you have kids who look at their parents and who are disrespectful, because after all, that's what kids are supposed to do. A healthy family life, ladies and gentlemen, is not built on condescension. It's not built on anger. It's not built on slander. It's not built on malice. It's built on respect and trust and love. And a healthy, happy home, ladies and gentlemen, where all the people within that home feel like they can talk freely to each other. I'm 32 years old and I still get nervous talking to my dad about most anything. But I at least know that I can if I need to. And that's what a healthy, happy home should be built on. And I pray every day that Logan and Hannah and Melina and baby 3 and baby 12 or whatever it is, yeah, your eyes got really big, didn't you? Whatever our family is, can always feel free to talk. But also to Melina, and especially not only about physical things, but especially about spiritual things. That's where our home truly is. Look at verse 12 in Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3, finishing off this section. He says here in Colossians chapter 3, I'll get to it in a second. Colossians chapter 3. Look at verse 12. He says, so those who have been chosen of God, as those who have been chosen of God, holy and beloved, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, bearing with one another, forgiving each other. Whoever has a complaint against anyone, just as the Lord forgave you, so also should you forgive them. Beyond all things, verse 14, put on love, which is the perfect bond of unity, and let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ richly dwell within you, with all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another, with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with thankfulness in your hearts to God. We tell you how most of the time we use Colossians 3:16. Most of the time when we look at Colossians chapter 3 and verse 16, it is usually in one very specific scenario when we are trying to proof text a cappella music. And even though that is there, Colossians chapter 3 verse 16 does very specifically describe a cappella music. I'm not debating that one bit. That's not the context. It's not as if Paul is talking about the nature of inter-church relationships and then he pivots and he says, oh yeah, I don't have a 12-piece band, by the way. It's not what he says. When he's talking in Colossians chapter 3, and he talks about setting your heart on things above, and then he talks about keeping immorality away from you, and then he talks about not lying to one another, and then he starts in verse 12 by talking about filling your hearts with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. He is talking about the exact same thing that verse 17 is about. It's letting the word of Christ richly dwell within you. The peace of God, as he would say in Philippians chapter 4, that surpasses all understanding, that harmony that exists. Let God rule in your hearts, and let God rule inside of your home. He talks about it in very, very specific terms. And as he mentions there in Colossians chapter 3, he says, seek that peace. Don't seek to create division. Don't seek to create a wedge between people. Seek to pursue peace. And he makes a special application there in Colossians chapter 3, verse 15, to the peace of Christ, which is not hard for all of us to understand. We take for granted right now that we have a relationship with God because we conveniently ignore all the times in our life that we've sinned. And we forget sometimes in the course of those sins that those sins have driven a wedge between us and God. And that Jesus Christ came down to earth to offer himself as a sacrifice to make that relationship possible in the first place. That's not because he wanted to do it. Although I'm sure he wanted to do it, but he physically did not want to do it. But what that shows, ladies and gentlemen, is that Jesus spent special effort trying to reconcile God and man. And what that means for us in the home is we need to do the exact same thing. Now, I'm not telling you right now that you need to go home and crucify yourself in the living room. That would be horrible. It would be completely necessary. That's not what I'm getting at. But if there are rifts inside of your home, if there are problem areas and there are father and son that haven't spoken hours, if there are family members, brothers that haven't spoken in years, then it's contingent on us to go and try to fix those relationships. I'm convinced, ladies and gentlemen, that some of us would rather go to the cross than try to fix situations in our home. We look towards Jesus and we say, of course he did this because he loves me. The real question is, do I love somebody else enough to try and fix that with them? Am I willing to reach across the party lines, for lack of a better phrase? Am I willing to humble myself and try to restore that relationship? Or am I going to sit here in bitterness and anger and try to just continue this path of pride that I'm on? I want you to look at Ephesians chapter 4. Ephesians, in a lot of ways, is kind of a sister passage, or a sister book with Colossians. There's a lot of very similar themes. Ephesians talks about the authority of Christ, so does Colossians. Ephesians talks about harmony, so does Colossians. Talks about the church, the Jew-Gentile nature of it, so does Colossians. And especially in Ephesians chapter 4, he talks about this harmony, but he talks about it specifically in terms of the home. In Ephesians chapter 4, starting at verse 25. He says, therefore, laying aside falsehood, speak truth, each one of you with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. And yet then the hardest passage, I would argue, in all the New Testament. Verse 26. Be angry and yet do not sin. As Russ said last week, he's got the angry part now. He's trying to work on the not sinning part. Be angry and yet do not sin, and do not let the sun go down in your anger, and do not give the devil an opportunity. Ladies and gentlemen, every single night we go to bed with a rift in our family is an opportunity for the devil to wedge farther in between our family and drive us apart. If I pillow my head tonight angry at Melina, I know amongst a lot of other things that the coffee won't be made in the morning, which just really sets me off. Actually, I'm the one that makes the coffee. Maybe it's the other way around. Anyways, but I know if we go to bed angry at each other, we will wake up and it'll be 10 times worse than it was the day before. A year later, it'll be 10 times, 1,000 times worse than it was a year ago. And it could be something minor. And it's a lot easier to fix it, ladies and gentlemen, when the situation happens rather than sitting on it 10 years, 20 years, 50 years in the future. And you look at somebody and you say, oh yeah, remember when you took my parking spot? Really sorry about that, by the way, they're not angry. Wish we could replay the last 50 years of our life. Fix those relationships now. Don't let Satan wedge in between and try to drive people away. But more often than that, ladies and gentlemen, be long-suffering with each other. A family like the church is built up of individuals who are very different. Logan has a very different temperament than me. Hannah has a different temperament than Melina. And all of us, and that applies to every family, but all of us are different in our own ways. And if I try to measure them by my own standards, I'm not only going to be frustrated, but it's incredibly unrealistic to demand that of them. Be long-suffering with each other. Be patient with each other. None of us are perfect. And I'm putting myself at the forefront of that. When you go back to Colossians chapter 3, that's why when you look at this passage as a whole, you see Colossians 3 not just as individual terms, which I think that's the very specific application. But you see it not only in Colossians chapter 3 in individual terms, you see it also in church terms. You can also see it in family terms. As we mentioned, the penultimate verse that we didn't read a second ago, but in verse 17, whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks through him to God the Father. God is the substance. Verses 18 to 21 will naturally take place. Wives, be subject to your husbands, as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives, and do not be embittered against them. Children, be obedient to your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing to the Lord. Fathers, do not exasperate your children, so that they will not lose heart. 4 verses. And And a lot of us will look at Colossians 3, verses 18 through 21 and say, why didn't Paul extrapolate that further? Why didn't he go more to the nature of submission? Why didn't he go more to the nature of love and respect with the husbands? Why didn't he go more to obedience for kids? And it's because, ladies and gentlemen, those principles are fleshed out in Colossians chapter 3. If my family gets Colossians chapter 3, 1 through 17 right, in Colossians chapter 3, verses 18 through 21 will fall naturally into place. I won't have a problem respecting my wife as she deserves to be respected. I won't look in verse 21 as my children in an exasperating type of way, frustrating them, and making them bitter towards God instead of bringing them up in the admonition of the truth. When we focus on ourselves as Christians, not just as an individual that I selfishly want, but when I focus on my life as a Christian, it naturally makes the family units fall into place. You can have heaven and home. You can have that perfect, idyllic family life that we've always dreamed about, minus the Ferrari, minus the lake house, minus the safari trips that we go on sometimes. I don't go on, some people go on. You can have a perfect family life without those things, because the substance is there. And if Christ is there, ladies and gentlemen, everything else falls into place. Let me tell you this, though. If Christ is not at the center of your home, if He is not the focal point of your life, then you can have all the Ferraris that you want, and it won't mean anything. Because your family will be broken. Because your family will be chaotic. Your family will be disorganized. And at the very least, your family and my family will not have an eternal place with God. Which is the only really thing that matters in this world. And so if you're here this morning and your life is apart from God, maybe you've put your focus on 100 other things except for the thing that matters the most. That I'm telling you right now, we need to reorient our life towards God. Make Christ the center of our life. Focus on Him, and you will have heaven. If you need salvation of a personal nature, we can make that happen right now. We can help you start your walk with God by washing you in baptism, washing those sins away, and letting you rise to walk with us as life. We can help you. The elders can help you. Won't you come?